So today I had a student ask me about using government produced sources like a government website or something like that in their research project. And I wanted to take a minute to talk about those kinds of sources and how you might use them. So these sources are fine generally. Some of them may even count as academic sources, but generally, most government websites are not going to count as academic sources. The thing to keep in mind about government sources, always treat them like propaganda. So this is true no matter what government produces the information, what government agency provides the information, where the government says it's getting the information. It doesn't matter if it's the US or the EU or Great Britain or Canada or Mexico, it doesn't matter. Always treat government sources the same way you treat propaganda. And there's a reason for this. I'm not trying to say that government sources are bad or anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that the information even is wrong that you're getting off of these websites. But any given regime, and remember, here in the United States, regime changes happen every 4 to 8 years on average. Every regime is going to have resources and generate studies that promote or reinforce their particular preferred policies. Okay. So even if the information is true, it's not going to be unbiased, or it's not going to be presented in an unbiased way. You might liken it to those old studies that were done a long time ago, like back in the 50s or the 40s or whatever, that showed that smoking wasn't always harmful and that smoking could even be good for you. And from a certain perspective, that's true, I guess. I mean, nicotine has been shown to reduce stress, never mind that it's highly addictive. um, Never mind that sucking a bunch of smoke into your lungs regularly is likely to severely increase your chances of cancer. Not everybody gets cancer who smokes. The vast majority of people do, but there are outliers. Take somebody like the old actor George Burns, who famously smoked until his dying day, and he lived to be like 100. He started smoking like when he was like 14 or something. And I think in the last years of his life, he was still smoking 3 to 4 cigars every day. So the studies are right. Not everybody who smokes dies, but people like George Burns are outliers, and most people who smoke are not going to end up like George Burns. They're more likely to end up like two other actors who died of cancer, Yul Brynner and John Wayne, who rotted away in a hospital about 20, died like 20 to 30 years before their expiration date because they smoked. So vanishingly few people who are regular smokers live to be as old and healthy as George Burns. Um, Also, if you do a little bit of digging, one of the things you're going to find is that most of those uh, studies that were done that found that smoking was in any way good for you were invariably and unsurprisingly produced by tobacco companies. So, uh, vested interest in twisting whatever findings they whatever facts they did find to fit a particular narrative. So it's the same thing with government resources or government sources, government websites, anything like that. Always treat them like propaganda. But just because government produced sources are suspect, that does not mean you avoid them altogether. You don't avoid necessarily any sources altogether. What it means is that you need to learn to recognize the limitations of your sources. And this is not just true of government sources, this is true of all sources. All sources have their limitations. So, government sources, those limitations, anything produced by a government or propagated by a government. Um, it may have policy biases underpinning it, or it may have, well, if you look at something like a corporate study, a study that's done by a particular corporation, it may have a profit motive bias underlying it. Doesn't necessarily mean that the information is a lie, but it's definitely going to be presented in such a way that benefits the corporation or that benefits the government. Same thing happens when you get sources that are produced by think tanks. Think tanks are organizations that are ideologically biased, and those ideological biases are going to make their way either into the study or into the presentation of the findings of the study. Okay, so it's not that these different sources are going to necessarily present factually incorrect information. It's that it these different the different people who produce the different sources are going to present the information differently based on their biases. And and this is a limitation that all sources have. But even scientific biases, and the hope is that when you read a scientific study or when you read an academic essay, the hope is that you're reading something that is truth oriented, that the goal of the person who designed the study or who is making the argument, that their goal is truth, that they are truth oriented. But this isn't always accurate. This isn't always the case. There could be lots of reasons that a scientist or an academic writes a particular thing that they write. But let's go with the best case scenario. Let's assume that an academic essay or that a scientific study is being done in good faith. The arguments are being made and the information is being presented in good faith. Even then, scientific studies and academic literature has its limitations. A scientific study, for example, may have design issues. The questions that were asked could be a problem. The sample size could be a problem. There could be limitations of geography or ethnicity or age, the age of the participants. Um, an academic study that was done in an Ivy League institution is going to be often limited to people who attend Ivy League institutions. Those are going to be their study participants. And every study, almost every study, by and large, is going to fall into the problem of self-selection bias. So you're dealing with people who are willing to participate in the study to begin with. All of those are examples of design flaws. Um, Scientific studies can also have issues of bias, and not just ideological bias or political bias, but biases related to what scientists think they know scientifically that may very well be wrong. Because scientists don't know what they don't know. Often scientists can't even imagine what they don't know. Let me give you an example. So, for decades, archaeologists rejected theories that suggested that human beings um, had lived on the American continent like 30,000 years ago, right? They assumed that the only way ancient humans could have gotten to the Americas was over a land bridge or an ice bridge that existed between Alaska and Russia, modern day Alaska and Russia. Um, the problem with this is that they kept finding evidence that humans were here earlier than this theorized migration. And so every time they'd find this evidence, they would just dismiss it. They would assume, because what they thought they knew, that humans couldn't have been here earlier than a certain time period. But the evidence kept mounting and kept mounting, and eventually they couldn't ignore it anymore, and they had to accept that humans were here long before they thought humans were here on the American continent. Now, what did that do? Well, that opened them up to all kinds of new thinking about how humans might have gotten here. And what they ended up discovering, what they think they know now, is that humans came in multiple waves to the Americas several different times over the last few ages of Earth's history. So let me use another example. For decades, medical scientists were certain that fat caused high cholesterol. People had high cholesterol because they ate too much fat. Sure, there were always these inexplicable outliers, but for most people, the medical science was clear. Um, if you had high cholesterol, it is because you were eating too much fat. But later, meta studies would be done. And a meta study is where you take all of the studies that have been done, you kind of try and look and see, figure something out based on all of the studies that have been done on a particular topic. And what they discovered is if you take all of those outliers, they actually disprove the thesis. What they discovered is that people who ate fatty foods, it wasn't necessarily the fatty foods that were causing the high cholesterol. But by dismissing all of those outliers because they couldn't make sense of them, these medical scientists ignored the very evidence that disproved their thesis. But when all of those outliers are taken together, they challenge the notion that high cholesterol is directly related to fat intake. And that forced medical science to go in different directions. And now we know that, for some people, high cholesterol is genetic. There's just nothing you can do about it. In some cases, high cholesterol may be related to fat intake, but people with high fat intake some of them can also have very low cholesterol. So it's more complicated than they thought it was. What these anecdotes illustrate is a common limitation of all academic research, not just scientific research. And that limitation kind of goes like this. So you gather a bunch of data. That data needs to be interpreted. If the data is inconclusive, then the interpretation needs to involve speculation. The speculation is uncertain. However, if the speculation is compelling enough, or plausible enough, or interesting enough, or just the right people in the right positions of power accept it, then the speculation develops into a consensus. That consensus then begins to form the foundation of a particular narrative. That narrative is then promulgated as quote unquote the science. And once it's picked up by the academic establishment and the popular imagination as scientific knowledge, it becomes entrenched and very, very hard to undo, to disentangle from what we believe, we think we know about what science is and how we acquire scientific knowledge. So even if this thing that we are referring to as scientific knowledge started out as nothing more than speculation, once it becomes entrenched under the moniker of scientific knowledge, it's very, very hard to upend it, even if it's wrong. This becomes even more of a problem once the scientific consensus or scientific knowledge is disseminated through the popular press or through government agencies and becomes popular wisdom, right? So once that happens, okay, so the limitations, the nuances, the complexities of scientific studies get lost in the popular press and in popular wisdom and government promotion of government policies. It just gets lost. Now you add to that the current way this knowledge is often disseminated in a hunt for clicks or likes or eyes on your website or pushing a particular political agenda or promoting particular policy or particular ideological narrative. And all of these nuances, all of these complexities just get bulldozed over. So in popular sources in particular, science, the word science, when they use that word science, um, it no longer refers to a method for testing hypotheses. When that word science is used in the popular press, it now becomes science with a capital S, right? It becomes an unassailable source of all truth. Recently, in fact, I heard something I thought was really funny that I'll share with you. So, for our secular materialist civilization, the phrase studies show works the same way rhetorically that the phrase thus saith the Lord worked for a previous civilization. So just keep that in mind. The phrase studies show um, is more a way to shut down conversation than it is to open up conversation. Uh, uh, Once the scientific consensus has been achieved, the thinking is done. There's no more thinking on this because science says X. So keep that in mind, right? Most people who use that phrase studies show aren't themselves scientists and they don't really know the studies even. So, this is partially how incorrect ideas become entrenched in the popular imagination. Um, Another example, over the past few decades, everyone knew that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And the popular press, including the popular medical press, repeated this truth over and over and over again. The problem is it wasn't true. In fact, it had never even been proved in uh, uh, through medical studies. Um, and this has recently come out, like in the last few years. Um, Psychiatrists knew this all along. They knew that there was no real solid evidence for this chemical imbalance theory of depression. Um, in fact, scientific studies had questioned this for a long time. And it turns out that this particular narrative had originally been promulgated by pharmaceutical companies. Um, you know, no ulterior motive there, right? But why then would psychiatrists and psychologists have promoted it? Well, it becomes entrenched wisdom, even within a discipline that's supposed to be scientific, like psychiatry and psychology. You can get this entrenched wisdom, and to some degree, uh, you have to think about this from the doctor's perspective. Patients come to a doctor expecting the doctor to know something and do something. And if the doctor doesn't know, but he has a pill that he can give to you, um, and maybe we'll try several of them until we figure out which one that works or seems to be working. Um, there's this element in which the doctor is providing hope and assurance for the patient. I'm of course here assuming good faith on the part of the doctors. And this leads me to the next thing I want to say. I don't want you to misunderstand me here. I am not trying to undermine your faith in science or medicine or the academy or anything. That's not my point. That's not what I'm trying to do. My point is simply to remind you that scientists, doctors, academics, journalists, philosophers, even the best of them, even the most honest of them, even those that argue in good faith as often as they can, they're just human. Government officials, just human. Teachers, just human. And therefore, anything produced by them is subject to the same limitations that affect every human being, including the fact that we only know what we've been taught or what we've experienced, and even the experience can be limited. Our interpretation of the experience can be wrong, and we don't know what we don't know. So as you engage in research, whether it's for this class or outside of this class, you always need to keep this in mind. Keep the limitations of your sources in mind. Don't just believe something because it's in an academic text or because you found it in some study or because it's published by, I don't know, some academic journal or because it's promulgated by some government agency. That doesn't make it true. And especially, don't just believe something because it flatters your preconceptions or your prejudices or your biases or your presuppositions. Now, at this point, I have to say, you don't just want to do the opposite of that either. You don't just want to go out doubting everything and everyone and just, they're all full of crap. You don't want to do that either. Knee jerk skepticism is just as bad as knee jerk credulity. Okay? Um, instead, instead of falling for one of those two vices, look for the virtuous mean. And you do that by doing your own research. If you find something flattering your biases, just take a step back and try to look at it with a more, not necessarily a skeptical eye, but proceed with caution. Do your research. Think about what it is you're reading. Study it out. Look for other arguments that disagree with what you're reading. Maybe you read something that challenges your presuppositions so much, be those political or religious or ideological or scientific or something your parents taught you or something your teachers say, and you read something and it challenges that, and you put up walls because you're scared of where it may lead. Well, rather than doing that, take a step back, study it out, think about it. Don't just assume it's wrong, but don't just assume it's right either. Look for alternative interpretations of the evidence. Try to come up with yourself alternative interpretations of the evidence. Look for weaknesses in what's being said, or not weaknesses, we'll say limitations. Is this particular person going further than the evidence suggests? Is this particular person, do they have a sense of intellectual humility? Are they unwilling to take the evidence further than it suggests? Look for clues regarding that stuff and have some intellectual humility yourself. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because you do like something doesn't mean it's right. And treat yourself with a little bit of compassion, because just like every other human, you have limitations. You don't know what you don't know. And let that work in you. Have a little bit of intellectual humility. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. I am not saying don't trust your doctors, don't trust the scientists, don't trust journalists. Please don't misinterpret this. What I'm saying is, if you want to be a truth-oriented scholar, if you want to know what's true rather than just what you prefer, you have to recognize your limitations. You have to recognize the limitations of your sources and the humans and the agencies who produced them. And that's all. That's all I'm saying here. Different kinds of sources are going to have different kinds of limitations, but the one they're all going to share is that they're all produced by humans, except for the ones that are produced by AI. And that's a whole other, that opens a whole other can of worms, right? A whole new set of limitations that we have to be aware of. So what does all this mean for your research project? Okay, primarily, what this means for your research project is as you go into this project, do not treat a research essay like an opinion essay. You don't go in thinking, I'm going to prove the truth of X belief that I have, or I am going to disprove why thing that I don't like or that I think is wrong. That that is not what we're doing here. That will just turn your research essay into a well researched opinion piece. Um, instead of doing that, you want to take this opportunity to research some narrowly focused element of the issue or the intellectual discussion that you're interested in. Let me give you an example, and I pull this from a former student who was interested in this, and this the student that kind of generated this entire discussion. So, let's say you're writing about sex ed. If you go into your research essay saying, I want to find evidence that abstinence only sex ed works, or that abstinence only sex ed doesn't work, or you go into your research essay saying, I want to prove that comprehensive sex ed works, or that comprehensive sex ed doesn't work. If you go in thinking you already know the truth of whatever it is you're looking into, you already understand it, you got this. The reality is, the truth is, you're probably going to find sources that support your position. And that's exactly the problem. Anyone with half a brain can find sources or rationalize information to prove their presuppositions. Anyone can do that. We're human beings. Human beings do that stuff all the time. But that also means that somebody who wanted to argue the exact opposite of what you're arguing could do the same thing. In fact, this is exactly the problem with agenda-driven research. Of course, you're going to find the evidence that you need to support your presuppositions, because that becomes the point of your project. And so the opposite, people who hold the opposite would be able to do the exact same thing, and more often than not, they'll do it with the exact same evidence that you're using. They'll just rationalize that evidence to support their presuppositions, whereas you rationalize the evidence to support your presuppositions. That's not what we're trying to do here. And so you have to undo that kind of thinking right off the bat in order to enter into scholarly conversation. I also don't want you thinking that you're trying to find the middle ground. And this is a trap that a lot of students kind of fall into. They think, okay, well, if I'm not trying to find out if this side's right or this side's right, then how do I do that? Well, then I try to find out how they're both right. That's not what we're doing either. That's called both sidesism. And that's not what we're doing, because again, you're going to fall into the same problem. If what you're trying to do is prove how both sides are right, of course you're going to prove it. And of course you're going to find evidence to prove it, because you are smart enough to be able to rationalize any evidence you find to support your presuppositions. And if you find something that challenges your presuppositions too much, you'll just ignore it. You just won't work that into your research project. That's not what we're doing here. You're not trying to prove one side or this side or that side or any side of some controversial issue. What you're trying to do is understand some aspect of a controversial issue better. And by understanding something better, you hope to get closer to the truth. And that means instead of being led by your biases, you have to let yourself be led by your curiosity. That doesn't mean that you doubt your biases, that you suddenly throw them out the window. Instead, that means that you're going to focus on some piece of this controversy that actually makes it controversial. And then you're going to ask questions that help you understand that aspect of the controversy. Let's go back to the sex ed thing. So often in sex ed, you've got a fight between abstinence only education and what's called comprehensive education. Well, what is meant by comprehensive? What are the underlying ideological assumptions supporting that concept? You can do the same thing with abstinence, right? Okay, what is meant by abstinence only? What are the underlying ideological assumptions supporting that framework of sex ed? Like, I'm going to assume that comprehensive sex ed doesn't address Catholic beliefs in chastity, right? And that generally speaking, abstinence only education isn't going to talk about producing children within a loving homosexual relationship, right? So each of these frameworks are going to be founded upon certain ideological presuppositions. What are they? Notice now that you can pursue that line of reasoning, that line of research, and it doesn't matter what side of the debate you fall on. The goal is to understand those underlying ideological presuppositions, to reveal them. What's going on? Why use the term comprehensive? Why use the term abstinence only? Who started using the term abstinence only? Was that the enemies of abstinence only framework, or is it the proponents of the abstinence only framework? Why use the word comprehensive? It's got such positive connotations. Comprehensive, we're going to talk about everything. But do they talk about everything? And so you have to keep in mind that it doesn't matter if I'm going to pursue this line of research. It actually doesn't matter what my biases are. It doesn't matter which side of this debate I fall into, even if I can see both sides very clearly. I'm like, oh, well, maybe a mix between the two will work really well. Even if that's my position, it doesn't matter. For the research, a truth-oriented research, an understanding-oriented research, I can look at something like the term comprehensive or the term abstinence, and I can start analyzing what's going on with those terms. I can ask, what are the ideological underpinnings of each term? What are their connotations versus their denotations of each term? Are these terms necessarily in conflict with each other? Why might some people put these positions into conflict if they're not necessarily in conflict? Whose interests does it serve to choose one or the other, or to have the two put into conflict with each other? What ideological commitments might explain preferences for one or the other? What do critics of these opposing positions mean when they say one works and the other doesn't work? Do they mean that each fails to achieve some specified goal for the framework? Or, like, what's the standard of success? What standard of success, objective standard of success, are they appealing to when they say one works and one doesn't? And what are the underlying ideological presuppositions framing that standard of success? Notice something about these questions that I'm asking. These are very probing questions. And again, it doesn't matter what my position on sex ed is I can research these questions, or I can use these questions to drive my research. And these questions help me transcend my biases. They help me be driven by curiosity rather than trying to win a debate. I'm trying to understand some element of the issue better. And that understanding, now I can take that understanding and go back into a debate and maybe argue better from an opinion focused, agenda driven position. But that's not the purpose of the research. The purpose of the research is understanding. These questions represent a curiosity driven project. They're an attempt to better understand some specific aspect of a controversial issue that I'm interested in. And anyway, that's a really long-winded way of saying, yes, you can use government and state websites, just don't rely on them. Be aware of their biases and be aware of their limitations. I hope you found this helpful. As you move forward in your research project, keep these things in mind. I'll talk to you again later. Bye.